I'm Diane Morean, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders. And I'm going to talk with you about what I learned this summer in meeting the challenge of condensing a 16-week course into 4 weeks and doing that online because of COVID. So first, I'd just like to start by asking you to have a look at this cake and to see all of its lovely layers and the nuanced decorations on top and how it just fits right into its 16 weeks box. And then think about what might happen if we tried to take that same cake and shove it into a box that's designed for a cake that only has 4 slices in it. And of course, what you might imagine is some sort of very confused mess that's really not so appealing anymore, and maybe even slightly undigestible. So that's what I was worried about in trying to take a 16-week graduate level neurology course and condense it into a 4-week setting with a brand new cohort of students. So they're all new to Elmhurst University, or most of them are, and they're in this position now where they're going to learn a graduate level neurology course, the first course that they're taking here in an online format in 4 weeks. So they don't have some of the inherent kinds of advantages that go along with being able to spread something out over 16 weeks, where they can, engage in distributed learning and have time to consolidate what they're learning and to actually form connections as a cohort, being with one another in their classes. And so what I was very afraid of was that in this endeavor to go from 16 weeks to 4 weeks, that we were going to end up with something like this. Students who were really exasperated and frustrated, feeling confused, having the material not be interesting to them anymore, and to just feel like they couldn't really digest everything that was trying to be shown to them. So the first thing that I did was to seek consultation. And that's when I learned a lot about backward design and principles of andragogy. And, this particular forum that we're in right now is one in which I'm going to try to privilege the tips that you can take away and use in your class. But I just briefly want to make sure that you understand what backward design is. So backward design is where you begin with identifying what it is that you want the students to walk away with. What do you want them to have learned in your course? What are the goals overall? And you move from those goals to how am I going to assess that? How am I going to figure out if in fact they do walk away with what I'm trying to give them? And then from that set, you plan their learning exercises and activities. And so they call it backward design because in more standard and maybe somewhat even outdated pedagogy, it was always kind of done in the reverse. When this is a little chart that I'm not going to review with you, I put it in so that you would have it for later if you wanted to have a look. Comparing ideas between these two ways of thinking about things. Andragogy has a lot of, it centers a lot on the learner and the learner's experience, not only in acquiring the course material, but in advancing as a learner, being able and more prepared to independently learn and to take what they've learned into the real world. So there's a lot of books written about this and so forth, but that was kind of where I was headed, trying to make good learners out of incomers to our program and have them feel confident in their ability to do that. Because what happens in our program is they go from the summer semester to the fall semester, where all of a sudden they have a lot more to learn and handle than most of them are really accustomed to. So learning to learn was an important part of the course. So the way that I set it up was to be both asynchronous and synchronous. And I will talk with you first about the asynchronous learning and then touch on the synchronous learning. And there may be bits and pieces here and there that I hope that you find helpful. So in terms of the asynchronous learning, this is when they did not have class that day. So this was Friday to Monday, basically over the weekend. There were these 3 activities that they engaged in. So, and I'll talk about each one of these: the flipped classroom, a jigsaw group project, and research project. And keep in mind, this is now kind of independent. This is what they're doing on their own. So in the flipped classroom environment, they had 3 pre-recorded lectures from me that they received on Friday afternoon. So it was a PowerPoint, but they had my voice teaching them all of those lectures. And they were tasked with the chore of reviewing those lectures, taking notes from them, and being prepared with that information before they arrived to class on Tuesday. And so it was self-paced and something that they needed to do independently. We did dedicate our first class, after reviewing the syllabus, to talking about how you might approach something like this, with everybody sharing at least one idea. And then we had these jigsaw group projects, which you may or may not have heard of. But basically what it is when you take a portion of your course content and you turn it over to the students. So I don't teach them this, and they know I'm not going to teach it. And so they are responsible for teaching it to each other. And basically, as you see in this little schematic, a couple people take on part of it and a couple of other people take on another part of it. And then it jigsaws together to where they've covered that portion of the class material. And here again, looking for collaboration and giving them opportunities to work with one another and build their confidence. And importantly, rather than, especially in a 4-week setting, trying to have equitable ways to measure their learning, this is something outside of test taking that I can measure learning and hopefully access different kinds of strengths in different students. And then finally, 4 weeks is a really short time to complete a whole research project, so we couldn't really do that. But what I did have them do was to choose five journal peer-reviewed articles on a topic that interested them. So it had to be something that they really wanted to learn about. And to create a research outline based on a template that I gave them. So the template was in the form of a typical journal article, and this gave them hopefully some format for consuming research and also for producing an eventual research, which they do have to do as a master's thesis in our program. So they could start thinking about topics a little bit and start thinking about how to organize that before they ever reached the semester where they'd have to actually do it. And hopefully in choosing a topic of their own interest, we're generating internal motivation with them, and importantly, giving me another way to give them feedback and another way to measure their learning. So that was the asynchronous learning that took place. And now we're going to talk a little bit about synchronous learning. So what we did was we had these 4 ways that we interacted in the classroom setting on Tuesday through Thursday. We had pre-tests and post-tests, some small group work, some big class work all together, and then some one-on-one work with just me and each student. So here you see the overall schedule of what happened, and they knew this is what was going to happen every week. We got into this rhythm very quickly because we only had 4 weeks. And basically what you'll see, and I'll talk about each one of these days, but basically what you see is that they come in Tuesday having consumed those lectures and have a pre-test. And they are tested on the material that they've been studying, and then they break into small groups, and with some feedback, they evaluate how it went. And I evaluate how it went, and it's the data that we collect from this pre-test that drives the instruction on Wednesday. So we know what we need to focus on, what needs strengthening. And then on Thursday, they get a post-test, which is a summative assessment, meaning that they get an actual score there. And we have time to work on group projects and individual meetings, and I'll show you how that worked. So on Tuesday, this is the most intensive of the days in terms of explaining it to you. They had this formative pre-test of the flipped lectures. They understood that this pre-test was not for a score. This is a participation grade. This goes towards participation. So how you get a grade here is that you just have to fill in every blank with your best effort. And if you show me that you thought about that question and you answered it mindfully, then you're going to get all of your participation points for the pre-test. And just as Heather was talking about, I do breathing exercises before every exam. And, I find it a way to help them to reduce the kind of test anxiety, but also from an executive functioning standpoint, by bringing their focus to just one thing, they're kind of setting themselves up for focusing on one thing at a time as they're test taking. When they finish the test, they get immediate feedback. It's online. They know what they got right, what they got wrong. If they got it wrong, what was the right answer? And further, where in those lectures can you go back and review the material that you got wrong? So they immediately get that feedback. They go into little groups. They think about what happened with their own test taking. They talk about it with each other. Again, independent learning, forming those connections. And then we all come back to class and collaboratively, we decided what's going to happen on Wednesday. Which things do we need to talk more about? And I went home and independently did an item analysis on those pre-tests to make sure that we had identified any areas that the overall class might be having difficulty with. So then when we came in on Wednesday, that's the lecture focused on the material we identified together, those things that I found when I did their item analysis of their pre-test. And rather than just sort of repeating the lectures, we talked about why don't we understand this? And throughout the recorded lectures, there were clinical examples. And then always in class, there were clinical examples. They're becoming clinicians. And so trying to say, okay, let's envision you're a speech language pathologist. You're arriving at the hospital where you work, and step by step, how do we use what we've learned? And so hoping to instill some kind of confidence in their ability to go forward and eventually use this material as they will need to do in the not so very distant future for this group. And then finally, they come in on Thursday, having the benefit of all of that pre-test stuff, and they're talking about it together, our data-driven lecture on Wednesday, and that's when they take the summative post-test. Again, they get the breathing exercises, they get immediate feedback that tells them how it went. They have a little time to review that feedback, and they know that that ends up in a summative score for them. Then they break out into groups. This happens every Thursday. And depending on where we are in the term, they're either working together on their jigsaw project or on the guided research project. And while they're doing that, I stay in the main room and one by one invite them to come in with me. And so they come in with me as brand new students to us. And I do an overall check-in with them. How is it going? What do you like? What don't you like? What can we do to be more helpful to you? And importantly, talk about their approach to studying this material. And so where I find the things that are going really well, a lot, reinforce the behaviors that you do want. That's kind of clinically speaking too, but that's what we do in the classroom. And then in terms of those things that aren't going so well and students who don't really know how to study, the framing is always something like, I wonder if you were to try X, I wonder what you think. Do you think that might be helpful? And so it's a collaborative process about trying to help elevate their learning so that they can walk away feeling as though they not only got the material, but that they know how to attack something that is pretty intensive in terms of what gets covered. So what ended up happening was, rather than us ending up in this situation where we actually didn't digest the material, they surprised me on, I always get emotional when I see this picture. They surprised me on the last day of class where everybody held up a sign that was a thank you sign. And it was really special to me. And, we did form those connections that Heather was talking about, which I think are so really important. So of course I thanked them, and you can probably see in this picture, I was crying then too. But anyway, thank you for listening, and wonder if you have any questions.
Diane, I'm wondering if you found in your experience just the routine and how that helps students just, process the information, because it is, like you said in the opening slide, taking something so complex and compressing it in such a short amount of time seems overwhelming. And I'm wondering just what your thought was just in terms of the routine and setting that up and how it helps students process that information.
Yeah, that's you kind of answered the question. You kind of answered it in asking it, because it's so true that in just providing them with that structure so that they always knew what to expect, it always happened at the same time. It didn't always happen in the same way because it was really dynamic, but I think that expectation and knowing what was next was something that really facilitated their learning. And I think them feeling the safety to self-evaluate and evaluate with each other, and then have time with just me to talk about it with a lot of positive reinforcement. I think that might have helped them to kind of get in a groove so that they could keep moving forward. And if they got stuck, hopefully I caught them so that we could keep moving.
Thank you for that response. Other questions for Diane?
Oh, one thing I think might have been a question I meant to say is just pre and post tests were not the same questions. It covered the same material, but they were not the same questions. That's a summative assessment, and we actually are responsible for making sure that they know what they need to know. And so it was on the same material, but not the same questions.